Do you ever feel like your time's up? Like there's no point hoping anymore? Game over, the die is cast. Fate has spoken and there's no hope anymore. Well, you're listening to a podcast about life and faith, so obviously I'm going to tell you that there's still hope, and I'm going to tell you why. So keep on listening. This is my podcast, Living on the Edge of Art, and I am Stella Burkhalter. We are in season 2 of this podcast, and in this season, I am reading through the Bible this year in 2025, looking for signs of hope, looking for answers to that predicament of feeling like you're on the edge and that maybe things feel a little hopeless. So I have been reading through, and if you've been listening, you've been reading with me through Kings and Chronicles and the stories of the Jews as a kingdom, and then the story of the kingdom being lost, of falling to enemies, and the people being carried off to exile in Babylon. And so last week, I shared the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah going back to the land. But we know that there were people who didn't go back to the land, at least not right away, or weren't able to at first, and they stayed in Babylon, in Persia, some of them in a city called Susa. And so this story of scripture is a story of someone who did that. Esther. She was born Hadassah, a Jewish girl, and she became an orphan. And she was under the care of her cousin, uncle, depending on how you translate that, Mordecai. And she lived with Mordecai in this time of exile. And the story tells us about the king of the time, King Xerxes. King Xerxes had a wife named Vashti, and for whatever reason, he wanted to parade her around at his banquet full of drunken men, and for whatever reason, she did not want to do that. And so he became displeased. The people became displeased, the leaders, and thought, if she can get away with saying no to the king, if she can get away with saying no to her husband, then every other woman will get uppity. So we need to make an example of her. And she went away, lost her title, or more likely lost her life as well. And so this opens up the story for a new queen to be chosen. And the Book of Esther tells us that all of the young virgins were summoned from all parts of the kingdom to be brought into the palace. The chosen ones were to undergo a month-long spa day, getting beautified for the king. And in the end, Esther was chosen to be the queen. And so in this story, her identity as a Jew was not known. But in the palace, there was an enemy named Haman. And Haman had an ancestral hatred toward the Jews. He was an Agagite, descendant of King Agag, who we read about a while back. And he wanted all the Jews gone. And so the plot thickens and the story twists and turns, but there's a part of the story that especially captivated me on this reading. And by the way, it's a short book. It's a self-contained story. It's a narrative. It's a play. And so I encourage you to read it for yourself. But in the story, Haman casts lots. He rolls the dice to decide what day, what month, all the Jews would be executed. And there it is, 13 Adar. The 13th of March. We just passed it if you're watching this in real time. The festival of Purim commemorates it. The word pur, P-U-R, is the word for dice or lots, and im is the plural, like Elohim or cherubim. And so it is the casting of dice. And that scene just stuck in my head, that chilling scene of these dice. And I'm not sure how they looked or how the numbers would have worked for the months and so forth, but just this visual of the die is cast, the date is set, it's happening, they're all going to die. Does your life ever feel like that? Like the die is cast? Like a decision has happened, something has happened, some twist of fate, and there's nothing you can do about it? Well, with God, there's always something you can do about it. The Book of Esther is interesting in that God's name is not mentioned, and prayer, worship are not mentioned. And so there were times where people wondered if this should even be part of the Hebrew Bible. But it is. And I think it's a story of how sometimes God's work is below the surface. Because over and over and over in the story, there's these coincidences that just wouldn't have all happened. Like sometimes God's hand is there and you don't always see it. God changes things and changes our lives. And so, as I mentioned, the celebration of Purim is a celebration of this story. And I read a great line: Jewish holidays can be summed up in 3 steps. They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. That's our story. That's Jesus' story. They tried to kill him. He was resurrected. Easter's coming. I'm planning my menu already. But when the story is told in Jewish tradition, it's a melodrama. And there are cheers and boos. There are clear good guys and bad guys. And so whenever you hear the name Mordecai, yay, you cheer. And whenever you hear the name Haman, you boo loudly and you do noisemakers. The Talmud even says that the way to celebrate Purim is to drink until you're unable to differentiate between bless Mordecai or curse Haman. So quite the party. But one of the important takeaways in the Book of Esther is that God is in Susa as well as Jerusalem. God is with us. So I want to talk about that a little bit more too. Before I move on to talking about what these things could mean for us in our present day, I want to make sure that I read to you from the Book of Esther. Esther chapter 4, mine is subtitled, Esther Agrees to Help the Jews. And the thing about this story is that she has become queen, and it is not known that she is a Jew. And so when she hears about this plot, about the die being cast, the date being set, she can just hunker down and keep being the queen. She doesn't have to concern herself with this. She can just let what's going to happen, happen. Because after all, what can she really do about it? Or she can out herself as a Jew, have her own life be at risk. What will she do? Esther 4, chapter 9. Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke and gave him a message saying, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out his golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them how to reply to Esther. Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than any other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. I wanted to tell you to watch a beautiful, beautiful movie called One Night with the King that tells this story. And so I watched it again last night, and I remember really liking it, especially just the cinematography and how beautiful the people were and the costumes and just all of it. But a lot of it kind of bugged me this time around because of the way the story was softened. It's a love story between Esther and the king. And it's hard to understand why she would have thought she couldn't just go into her husband, this man that she loved and who in the movie loved her. And I think that worked for me as a young woman, a romantic story in this beautiful setting. But reading it now, as the old crone that I am, maybe a little more cynical, wow, this story, I mean, it's not a love story. It's a man who wants to parade his wife around, and doing a little research, it could be inferred between the lines that what he wanted to do is have her prance around naked. And she refuses and loses her life, or at least her position. What a thing. He's not like a boyfriend you want. And then when he gathers up all the young women, it's not like, I've heard it called a beauty contest. It wasn't a beauty contest they were willingly participating in. It was them parading around, him having sex with a different one of them every night, presumably till he found the one he wanted. And they didn't get a say in the matter. They didn't get to choose. If you happened to be beautiful, you were in trouble because, you had to just be yanked out of your life into a harem and locked up. I get a little frustrated about my life and what it means to be a woman, especially a woman preacher, a woman clergy, in an age where there are just still a lot of people who think that it's a horrible thing and that we women are the reason the church is declining. But then I look at a story like this and think, I'm glad I didn't live there at that time and place. I mean, this woman had no agency. And so for her to say that she would go before the king and not only out herself as a Jew, but to go to him without being summoned. I mean, it's hard to even imagine that for us in our day of age, that you can't just go talk to somebody until they hold out the golden scepter to you. In the movie, they had to build up that tension of how big a moment that was. And so the king is actually in his court with all these men around. It's a tense moment as they're discussing whether or not they're going to go to war. And she has to run through the rain, and she bursts into this golden room in her golden dress and flings the doors open, soaking wet. And she is quite the heroine. And I thought, just read this story. You don't need to add all this drama. There's a lot of drama in the story already there. The way it's told, raw as it is, with this woman who doesn't get to choose and doesn't get to speak up. And yet there's this moment where she says, if I perish, I perish. Where Mordecai challenges her and says, perhaps you have what you have, this place, for this time in this place. And so I'm inspired as I read it, as countless generations have been. It's an inspiring story of what it means to have courage and to have faith, the faith to know that the die isn't cast, it's not all set. God can still move in any situation. And I love that the day that was set for the execution of the Jews ended up, through a series of events, becoming the day of celebration of their freedom. And so we can celebrate too. I have something else I want to read to you. The cover art for this episode is the Greek letter delta, and it is art that I created for a book I wrote, Living Between Alpha and Omega, Praying the Greek Alphabet in Uncertain Times. And I think out of all the letters in this book I wrote, the letter D, or delta, is the one I've used in prayer the most, and I thought of it in this situation. You can find out about this book and order it on my website, www.pastorstella.net. And I wanted to to just read it to you. This is the letter D. The Greek letter D is called delta. It began its evolution as a square with a taller side to represent a doorway. As I say in this book, all letters are basically symbols for an idea or thing, so D was a doorway. Hebrews made this doorway one-sided and called it daled, which means doorway. Greeks shaped it like a triangle and called it delta. Therefore, we use that word to name the triangle-shaped area formed by a branching river and its sediment. Scientists use delta's triangle symbol to designate a change or a set of changes. So the word delta in science literally means difference or change. A change symbol is a good one for the life of faith and for living in the unknown. When you're living in the in-between, on the edge, you long for positive change, and you dread that you might be descending into negative change from which you won't be able to emerge. When we struggle with the depressing sameness of life, we need to be reminded of the positive change that God can bring. We need to be reminded of our human potential in the potter's hands. Our God is in the change business. He changed a handful of dust into a man when he breathed the breath of life into it. He changed a pile of dry bones into a living thing of sinew and muscle and flesh in Jeremiah's vision. And when Jesus walked the earth, he changed people whose skin was covered with leprous sores into whole and healed, rejoicing people, to name just a few examples from Scripture. Jesus was changed at the Transfiguration so that his disciples could get a glimpse of him in brilliant radiance before he began the journey to the cross. What a wonder to imagine what we will be like when we are transformed like this too. Praise God for good change. Delta is a good letter to meditate upon because its very shape allows us to imagine turning around. Think of the icon on a screensaver where a logo bounces from wall to wall on your computer screen in a triangle pattern. You may feel like your life is careening fast in a bad direction, but just like that, ping, things can change and you bounce into a completely new trajectory. It's that way with God. And so I write some more about the word based on Greek doxology. But I want to just keep you with these images, the rolled dice, the set future versus delta, the movement, the change. Because there have been a few times where I have just felt so much despair and just that idea of a ping, of something changing completely, of a new thing happening as I prayed for my children and myself, people that are stuck in just seemingly hopeless situations. When I was at Covenant helping administer benevolence money to people who were in financial crisis, I knew that there was so little I could do, and my heart would break for them. But so often, change comes, ping, out of nowhere. And not nowhere, actually, out of the heart of God. Our lives can and do change. And so I've been picturing that, just waiting for the change to come. I read a good quote this week. It said, for people of faith, when we know that God can change things, we wait differently. And so I'm waiting differently for the changes that I'm hoping for. And I invite you to do that too as you pray this week. See you next time. And possibly this coming Saturday, I will be at the Mason Art and Wine Festival on the Square, encouraging people to be creative. And so come out. Hope to see you. Be blessed.